So I think when we deal with talented kids, it's sometimes a challenge. Everybody always talks about the challenge of dealing with children who have difficulties, reading difficulties, learning difficulties, behavioral difficulties, and we make that like it's the only challenge that you have with kids, and it is a challenge. No, not undermining or diminishing it in any way, but there's another kind of challenge, and that's the challenge of the talented child. What's the challenge of a talented child?
So much pressure.
Okay, so what kind of pressure?
To always succeed.
So where does that pressure come from? The pressure to succeed comes from us, right? Okay, so I think let's just unpack that a little bit. So when you talk about the pressure to succeed in what way? To succeed in their particular given talent. So let's say, for argument's sake, that the child is very academic, then there's naturally going to be pressure to really achieve academically. And if the child is athletic, there'll be pressure to achieve athletically, and if the child is autistic, to achieve artistically, and so it goes, right? Okay, fine. So there's pressure, and then what? What actually happens as a result of that pressure?
Performance anxiety.
Okay, so who has the performance anxiety, the child or the parent? It might be a little bit of a mix in terms of who has the performance anxiety. There's no question that the children are going to develop that performance anxiety. There's no question. But I think our parents kind of vicariously live through the children, so some of that anxiety becomes the anxiety of the parents as well. So it's not so straightforward. Okay, fine, fair enough. But what else is going to happen besides the emotional? Because that's definitely true. There's going to be some emotional component. What happens practically when you have a child who's incredibly talented in a particular area?
Areas lack, or risk they're not so well rounded.
Okay, so correct. So a person might become extreme, right? So they have a particular area of talent which is really extreme, and they have other areas that lag. And we're trying to obviously have well-balanced or all-rounded, well-rounded children, and it's not so simple. Agreed, 100%. What else happens?
Oh, so they expect to be at a certain level, and when they miss it, they feel failure. And
okay, that's absolutely true. So we set them up for failure or set them up for disappointment. They don't necessarily, failure is not necessarily
be the best.
Right. And you know what's interesting about that is, and I don't know that we necessarily anticipate this early enough. So you have a child who's exceptional in a particular area in their environment. Either they or we expect that because they're excellent in this particular environment, they'll always be that way. And then we put them into a more challenging environment, because that's what happens. That's the nature of the talented child, is that they will then graduate to a more challenging environment. And that's where they most likely will experience their first failures.
My parents never used to come watch me play tennis matches because I used to put too much pressure, and I couldn't succeed if they were there.
Oh, that's interesting.
They like, why am I played like a Grand Slam tournament and they weren't there.
That's interesting, because they actually created the pressure.
Yeah, they never used to.
That's really interesting. So I think there's a fair amount of research on kids who are the top of their class in high school and how difficult it is for them when they go to university. Because the top of the class will typically get into the tougher courses. The tougher courses will collate the top of the class from a whole lot of schools. And now you're no longer competing against average, you're actually competing against exceptional. So there's a lot of that, the performance anxiety and the letdown.
Perseverance from in high school. So you're like, okay, actually, well, then I must not be good enough. So then you just do nothing. Yeah,
exactly. Especially if they're that exceptional relative to the average. So then they're not taught or they're not encouraged to persevere or to be particularly resilient, because they're just kind of taken in their stride. And there's quite, like I said, there's quite a lot of research about what happens psychologically, emotionally, and even academically. I'm using academics as an example. It wouldn't be any different in sport. It wouldn't be any different in the performing arts. So you think you're amazing, and then suddenly you're thrust into this environment where other people are just as amazing, and now you're the average. And if you don't have the skills, if you haven't been taught those skills of going out there and achieving and pushing and persevering and, you know, motoring your way through, you can collapse pretty radically. And the collapse can have lifelong effects, right? Because in school you were amazing and now you're a nothing, and how are you ever going to succeed in life? So when you, on analysis, you actually realize that the talented child has quite a lot of challenge. Potential challenge, right? I think there's another layer of challenge as well, which nobody's mentioned yet. Maybe you were going to still get there, I don't know. And that is the dilemma of the parent who notices the unique talent of their child and now has the dilemma of what do we do with this child. And this is coming specifically, I think, from a Jewish perspective, because let's say, for argument's sake, let's use sport as an example. So if you've got a really athletic child, you immediately have the dilemma of whether or not to keep them in a Jewish school. Because we all know that our Jewish schools are not going to produce national sports people. As great as we think our sport is, and you know, depending which school you're at, every Friday they have at the assembly the sports results, and we played against this school and we won, and it all sounds really amazing. But tachlis, bottom line, if you have a truly gifted athlete as a child, chances are that the Jewish school system is not going to be where they'll be able to achieve, right? So now you've got another dilemma, and that's the dilemma of how do we weigh up the values that we have as Jewish people and what values the kid will get from the school versus the opportunity cost, because here's this child who could theoretically go off and become a national sporting hero. Just recently there was a boy in the United States who's from keep Shabbos and everything, so became this you know, I think this one was actually baseball. There was basketball was already a while ago. This is now Major League Baseball, which is like a big deal. So you get this, it creates this massive dilemma. Or the performing arts would be another one, right? Our Jewish schools are not going to produce people who are going to go to Hollywood or Broadway. It's just, that's not our schools. Even our most, you know. So there's this dilemma. Now what do? Do you send your child to a school of the arts? And that, I think there the dilemma is even greater, because if you send a child, typically, if you're sending a child to another school for athletics, for sport, so basically, typically those schools that are more sport-oriented tend also to have very healthy structures, because there's a tremendous discipline that goes with the sporting world. And with that, you know, there are disciplines of respect for other people's religion, respect, etc. You might have seen that recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was this Frum child at Kes who went to play his cricket match. It was like his last cricket match, and the whole school walked with him because he used to walk to the match on Shabbos. Well, the whole team walked with him on Shabbos. You know, you get that kind of respect you can anticipate in a school which is around the discipline of an athletic strength, because it is a disciplined part of the world, a part of life. Whereas if you had to, for example, move a child, let's say, to a school of arts, typically the arts are the opposite of discipline. You know, they're very inclusive environments and liberal environments, and all of the things that we value as Jewish people are not necessarily valued in that context. So it becomes, I think, a greater dilemma. So you've got this child with amazing musical talent or acting talent or singing talent, and it's quite limiting. And even if it's not a matter of which school you're going to put them into, the reality is that the opportunities that they'll have in order to perform are going to clash with other things. Shabbos, Yom Tov, kosher food, and not to mention, of course, the way that, you know, the levels of morality in the performing arts are nothing like the levels of morality that we would stand for. So these are the dilemmas that emerge with the highly talented child. It's not so simple. Everybody thinks the child with challenges, oh no, they're going to have to go to a school that deals with their particular challenge, and it's not going to be a Jewish school. Actually realize that the schools that are the so-called remedial or whatever other terms, you know, the schools that deal with children with challenges are usually incredibly respectful and accommodating of the value systems of the different groups that come into the school. So it feels like there's so much done to accommodate and to hold children who have typical challenges, but the child who has the challenge of success, I don't know that we have much of a structure in order to be able to hold them. And then we have another layer of dilemma, and that is, well, what do we do? Just as parents, what do we do with their challenge? Do we turn it into a focus in their, with a talent? Do we turn it into a focus in their lives? Or do we just like let it run its course? And let's say the child is really musical, so maybe one day they'll be the wedding band, the popular wedding band in town. You know, it's quite a difficult challenge. You know, what do you do with this talent? Where do you direct it? I think if it's academic talent, it's a little easier, because big deal, so they'll become academically successful. That's okay. It's not going to be unless they want to go into the sciences and start questioning beliefs in God. Okay, that might be a challenge for us. But the person who wants to go off and play professional sport or enter into the performing arts, that's going to be a massive challenge for us. So early on, we could just downplay the talent and say, yeah, listen, you're musical, you're a good singer, but it's okay. You'll just stick with the local kind of community events. And then you start to wonder, well, am I robbing my child of his or her opportunity?
So it's very interesting. My son, he's a brilliant soccer player, but he can't play when it's a match. He gets nervous and he gets performance anxiety and he can't be. So
I wonder where he gets it from.
I wonder. And now we put him in the B team and he's like a different child.
Yeah.
He's like so calm and he scores all the goals and there's no pressure and it's amazing, the difference.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes that is what we need to do, is actually remove that stress element to their area of talent. So talent doesn't have to equal stress. Okay, it's a really good point. There's a family who I know that they have a child with, and they're not a particularly religious family, but they're a very strongly traditional family, and they have a child who's very talented in the performing arts. And I've just watched over the years how it's been a very big dilemma for them as a family, because on the one hand, they've introduced their child to opportunity, and on the other hand, they've kind of tried to rein it in, that the child doesn't go flying off to London or New York and joining that world, because it is a frightening world for a person who has the kind of values that we have. And like I say, they're not a frum family, it's just a traditional family. And by contrast, I know another family who has a very athletic child, and this has become the focus of this particular child's, that's where they're going. That's become the focus of their life. And maybe they will make it to the national team. It is possible in their chosen sport. And it's interesting that this family doesn't have the same dilemma. They're quite okay with it. We're not from people. It's okay. And so it goes. So it's a fascinating topic. When you actually think about it, especially if you're dealing with it, especially if you have a particularly talented child. So it raises all of these questions, and how do you balance, and how do you decide where you're going to go, and what you're going to do, and what you're going to emphasize, and what you're going to highlight, and what you're not going to highlight, where your red lines are. It's not so simple, right? So there's a really interesting story in the Torah that we're actually going to read about in this week's parasha that talks about talent. And it's mostly overlooked, I think, by many, many people when learning. First of all, this parasha generally is overlooked because it feels like it's repetition. We already did this a few weeks ago. We read about what makes a mishkan. You've got to have these pieces and those boards and those skins and this made out of gold and that made out of copper, So it feels like a repetition because effectively this parasha tells us, and they did it. Even Rashi in his commentary on the parasha says, I've already explained this, which kind of, it indicates that why do we need all this information? We've already heard it before. And one of the profound insights is that when we heard it before, it was all in the language of instruction, which effectively means that's Hashem saying this is what it should look like. And the value of this parasha is the people actually doing it. And the Torah is giving us a very powerful message in that there's a huge difference between how it looks on paper and how it looks in practice, or how it looks in Hashem's vision and how it looks in our application. And sometimes you might think that our application doesn't look as good as Hashem's vision. So that's why the Torah goes through it step by step to say, well, Hashem values our application even if it's not so perfect. Okay, but that's not where we're going today. Instead, we're going to look at this very unique story about a very strange talent. You've probably heard of it before, because if you've read it, it kind of stands out. But it gives us a lot of food for thought about talent and how you use talent and direct talent and manage talent. It's very interesting. So the story goes like this. When it came to contributing to the Mishkan, both men and women participated. Now, why am I making a big fuss about that? Because you'd probably think it's obvious. It was a communal affair, a communal project. Everybody got involved. So the reason I mention that both men and women were involved is because when you actually read the story, remember, this is a story that had a few parts. Firstly, they had to contribute the materials, everything from gold right down to goat hair skin or goat hair. So there's a broad range of contribution, financial or material contribution. Then there was a skills contribution, because obviously you had to have carpenters, you had to have weavers, you had to have builders, you had to have craftsmen who knew how to, smiths who knew how to work with gold or with silver, whatever it is. So there was a broad range of talent commitment. And then, of course, there was a commitment of time. So you had the people that actually gave of their time to do these various things. So what's interesting is it's this communal project, and not only is it shared across the scale, the spectrum of men and women, but what's interesting is the Torah makes a big deal about the fact that the women overtook the men in participation, which is quite interesting, right? You don't anticipate that. You think, oh, this is this patriarchal society, the Jews in the desert, you know, the male leadership. You just anticipate that when it comes to building the Mishkan, that was going to be run by men, let's be honest. The Kohanim were all going to be men. You anticipate that the men were going to be the ones who contributed the most, and the women would be on the sidelines, you know, kind of putting up the decorations or something like that. But it turns out that it wasn't that way. And that's one of the things the parasha teaches us this week. It says, Vayavoyu ha'anoshim al hanoshim, that the men effectively followed the women. So the women were kind of leading the charge. Interesting, right? And it's only when we talk about the women's contribution that we use words like talent. It's really interesting. So let's bear in mind, there had to be carpenters who fashioned all the various woodwork of the Mishkan. You had to have builders who put it all together. You had to have smiths who did all the gold and silver. You had to have jewelers to be able to put the gems into the various places for the Kohanim's clothing. You had to have seamstresses or tailors or whatever it was, etc. So there's a lot of skill, there's a lot of talent that goes into it. And yet the only time in the whole story where the Torah speaks about talent is only in the case of a particular group of women. Interesting. So now we've got to work out, what did these women do that was considered such an amazing talent? So take a guess. Out of all the things that you could possibly have done, what do you think required the most unique talent? So let's recap. We need carpenters, we need metalsmiths, we need builders, we need weavers, sewers, seamstresses, whatever you want to call them, jewelers, engravers. Which do you think required the greatest talent? Now bear in mind, talent means obviously something which is unique, something that not everybody can do.
Engraving.
So okay, so you think something like engraving, right? So it turns out that the engraving was all done by this little worm called the shamir worm. This worm, snail, whatever it was. That did all the engraving, so you didn't need any major human talent for that. Even though you would expect it, right? Because engraving is quite delicate. Turns out there was no human talent for that. So what was the great human talent? So that this is what the Torah tells us. B'chol isha chochmas leiv, so that's talent. Chochmas leiv is the wisdom of the heart, which basically means like some unique kind of a skill or insight that they had. So what did they do? Tavu es ha'izim. They're the ones who wove the goat hair that was going to be made. So basically what they had to do is they had to make like little mats out of goat's hair, because I would imagine out of the average goat, you'd probably get enough hair for a medium-sized mat. And then all of those mats eventually were sewn together, and that would become the upper covering of the Mishkan. So let's just recall how the Mishkan was made. All the walls were made out of wood. That wood was then coated with gold. It was held together by being placed into silver bases with clips at the top that held them together and poles that ran through them. So that gave us like this fairly stable structure of the Mishkan. But it had no roof. Meaning to say, they didn't use wood for the roof. Instead, in order to make the roof, they used the various skins of animals and wool and the hair of these goats. And that made layers of coverings. Some of the coverings had to be dyed purple, some of them had to be dyed red, some had to be dyed blue, or the techeles color, which is possibly not blue, might be more of like a green color. Right? Those are the different layers of covering that they had to put over the top of the Mishkan. By the way, it's just interesting, that creates a Mishkan that reflects the hierarchy of life on earth. So you've got the ground, because the Mishkan didn't have a floor, so wherever it was erected, the ground would become the base. That's the inanimate world. And then you had wood, which was used for the structure, so that comes from the plant kingdom. And then on top of that, you had the hair and the skin of animals, so that represents the animal kingdom. Then the human would enter into that space and do the service of Hashem. So you incorporate all the elements of the world. So there, again, some of those coverings were made out of wool, and some of those coverings were made out of this goat hair. And the Torah identifies that the unique talent was in weaving the goat hair. Okay, so I don't know, I've never tried to weave anything in my life. I don't know how difficult it is, but I would assume that as talents go, you don't have to get 6 distinctions in matric to weave goat's hair. I don't think. I mean, you have to be fairly handy, I would assume, you know, but I don't believe it compares necessarily. You wouldn't anticipate that it compares with being a super athlete or being a major artist or something like that. It's weaving goat hairs, you know. So what's the massive talent that went on with weaving the goat's hair? So Rashi tells us the unique talent was that they wove the goat's hair while it was still on the goats. Okay, now that's not simple. Because I don't know about you, if you own a dog, anybody who owns a dog knows how difficult it is just to try and wash a dog. I mean, these are living creatures, you know, they writhe, they move, and that's just trying to clean the thing. Can you imagine trying to hold still so that I could weave your hair? You know, it's like a weird principle, right? And you can't explain it to the goat. You can't reason with a goat. It's like, just stay here for the next 6 hours. We're going to weave your hair into some kind of it's ridiculous, right? So that took this very unique talent to be able to not just do the job, but to do it in such a way that it actually probably came out looking amazing. Otherwise, it wouldn't be considered a talent. If it came out looking like a dog's breakfast, that would not have been given accolades in the Torah. Oh, wow, look how talented these people are. So now you've got to ask yourself a question. Question is, why? Why did they do this? Was this like some kind of a show? You know, like a talent show? Let's see what we can do, see if you could beat us. Like, why are they doing this? Just take off the goat's hair and then do what you got to do. In fact, it's interesting because, remember, there's different covers that go over the Mishkan. Some are made out of goat's hair and some are made out of wool. We have no record of the fact that anybody tried to spin the wool while it was still on the sheep. So it's pretty clear that they sheared the wool and then they produced it. So why not the goat's hair? Like, what's the chap? What are they trying to achieve over here by doing this weird, this weird type of weaving? It just doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so with regards to the wool, there's a fairly pragmatic answer to why they had to shear the wool off first. Let's remember, what did the wool look like by the time it was made into the covers for the Mishkan? Red, purple, or the techeles color. In other words, the wool had to be dyed. Now, you're not going to take a sheep and stick the whole sheep into the dye. That's definitely not going to happen. It's not going to be practical. I don't know how long a piece of material has to sit in a dye in those days, you know, in order to if they weren't chemical dyes, they were natural dyes. So probably, I'm assuming, took a bit of time, you know, to soak into the dye and to actually absorb the color. The sheep are not sitting in a vat getting dyed. You know, that's not practical. So we get it. There was no other way to produce the wool except to take it off the sheep, to first shear it, then dye it, and then turn it into whatever it was that was going to be used as the cover. So that makes sense. Fine, we get it. It's pragmatic reason. We understand why they had to first shear the sheep. But what's the reason? Now, flipping it, what's the reason that you would want to dafka challenge yourself to have this crazy situation where, you know, you've got this moving goat and you're trying to weave the hair of the goat into a mat that you're going to still cut off because it still has to be connected to all the other mats in order to make the cover for the Mishkan? That doesn't seem to make any sense, right?
No, it'll still grow on it.
Okay, so that's going to make things worse for you, right? If it's still growing. Yeah. Can you imagine if you go for tea break and come, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to grow that quickly, but you get the idea, right? So I'll tell you an interesting thing, just because you've said that. I'll tell you another interesting thing. There's a very intriguing conversation that happens. Rashi records a conversation between Moshe, who obviously is, if you want to call it the head of the whole project, and Bezalel, who's the project manager. So Bezalel is appointed, people call him the architect of the Mishkan, but it's not correct, because Hashem told him what the Mishkan has to look like. Hashem is the architect of the Mishkan. Bezalel is like the project manager. You know, he made sure that everything worked in a logical sequence and that it was all done properly, etc., etc. So they have an interesting conversation. The conversation goes like this. Moshe tells Bezalel, what Hashem says is, you should first make all of the elements that go inside the Mishkan, like the menorah and the shulchan, the table, etc. And then after that, build the Mishkan. So Bezalel says to Moshe, that doesn't make any sense. When do you ever first make the furniture and then make the structure? Doesn't make any sense. First you need the structure and then put in the furniture. And the expression that he uses, or at least that Rashi, so to speak, paraphrases is, Minhag goy shel oilam. the normal behavior of the world is first you create the structure, and then you create what belongs inside the structure. So Moshe is very impressed with that, and he says, now I know why you called Betzalel. Because Betzalel actually stands for, could be read, Betzael Kael, in Hashem's shadow. In other words, you kind of, you have this aura of godliness that's guiding you in what you're doing, and that's why you've called this correctly. And the right way to do things is to first make the structure and then put the things inside the structure. Now, by the same logic, when you build a house, you build the walls before the roof, yes? I mean, shouldn't be difficult, this. Shouldn't be difficult. I remember when I was a kid, there was a house, there was 2 houses away from where we lived, and they gutted the house completely and renovated it from scratch. And the way they gutted it is they actually took out all the external walls. So all the structural internal walls were there, but when you looked at it from the outside, it looked like a floating roof because they had left the roof and they'd taken out all the external walls. So it was this bizarre concept of this, a roof without a house. Just strange, right? But you can't do that structurally. You can't build from the roof down. There is no way to build from the roof down, right? So in the Mishkan, what do you expect you'd have to make first? The walls or the covers that are going to be the roof? Following this logic. The walls. You have to make the walls first, right? Surely. Yet, when you look in the Torah, you find that it's the opposite. Firstly, the instruction from Hashem in Parashas Terumah, and the way it was done in practice in this week's parasha, first they make the skins or the coverings that are going to come on the roof, and only after that they produce the walls. Why is that? Also doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense because it's just not a practical, in the same way as Betzalel tells Moshe, you've got to follow some kind of a logical process of how you construct things. You've got to follow a logical process here as well. So that's going to come back to the you said about the hair growing, right? So it's not about the hair growing. Let's think for a second. What happens when you remove anything from a living creature? It will die, basically. So again, I'm not an expert. I've never knitted. I've never woven. So I don't know. But I think it's probably fair to say that when you're dealing with goat's hair as opposed to wool, wool is possibly an easier material to work with. It's like I think it's a softer material, right? Where hair, it's very thin and it's going to become brittle and whatever the case is. So the minute you shear it off the goats, the clock is ticking in terms of how long you have to work with it to be able to create these mats that you need to create. So possibly the reason why they wanted to do the mats, to do the weaving while it's still on the goat is because they want Hashem to have the best stuff for his Mishkan. So you're going to get the softest, most flexible kind of hair while it's still on the goat. So you're going to work while it's still on the goat. And that would also be the same logic why it happens before the walls. Because once you've got those mats, the clock is ticking. You've got to put them together as quickly as possible. So it might not be logical to do the roof first, but there's a different logical argument for it because as soon as you take each mat off, you only have a period of time before you can put them all together while they are still so flexible and fresh. So that was really the motivation. So in other words, their motivation is that they want to make sure that what they're producing for Hashem's home is the best possible thing that you could produce for Hashem's home. That's what their motivation is. But there's another layer to this motivation, really interesting layer to this motivation. And before we get to that layer, just one other thought. So I mentioned to you that the Mishkan incorporates the various strata of life, right? So you've got the inanimate represented by the earth. You've got the plant world represented by the wood, which were going to become the panels that would make the walls. And then you have the animal kingdom represented by the covers that would be made from the hair and the wool of animals that would go on top of the Mishkan. Now, by virtue of the fact that the women make these mats while it's still on the animal, that means they're actually working with a material that is still in the category of animal, which is a more advanced category of life. If they remove the hair, then it drops down to the inanimate level. So no, it's not just that they wanted to contribute something which is really fresh and therefore they would do a better job of making these mats because they've got more flexible material to work with. They actually wanted to contribute something of a higher quality in terms of quality of life. So their motivation is very deep, very profound, you know, when you consider it. But there's one more layer to the story that we really have to understand. I don't know when and how the women realized that they had this talent. It's a good question, right? Which is kind of, I suppose, like the first person who ever invented any kind of sport. What made them think of that? I can totally see a guy kicking a coconut, you know, and coming up with some kind of a ball game. But what on earth precipitated something like ice hockey? You know, where did that come from? So in the same way, what on earth precipitated, let's try weaving on a moving goat? We don't know. We have absolutely no historical background. But somehow, at some point, these women who belong to this unique category of talented people, at some point became aware of the fact that they had this very, very unique talent. Because you can be assured that 99.9% of all humans who have ever lived would not be able to do what they had done. To start weaving these beautifully manicured mats on the backs of goats. I mean, it's a bizarre concept. So,
people? Like, were they real people?
They were normal, real people, absolutely, real people. Look, the reality is, as we know, if you've ever encountered a person with a very niche but very advanced talent, you actually look at them and think, is that normal? Is that real? Right? So can you imagine these people must have come in front of Moshe on, what was it called? The Desert's Got Talent. I don't know what the show was called in those days, you know. And they showed their talent. What prompted them to recognize that they had this talent? I don't know. But what's interesting about it, and this is really what Rashi wants us to know, and this is why the Torah is telling us this story, is what attitude they took when they recognized that they had a talent. And I feel that this is something so valuable for dealing either with our own talents or while trying to nurture our children with their talents, is there's a conventional way that we approach talent, and it's been the conventional way taught by the world and practiced by the world, and because of that it's kind of infiltrated our thinking, and we don't recognize that there's also a Jewish way to think about talent. And that's what's so unique about the story. So the conventional way to think about talent is, if your talent does not get you fame and fortune, then you've wasted your talent. So in other words, in the conventional world, let's say that somebody has an amazing singing voice. If they don't become a platinum record holder, that was a waste of that voice. And if your child has this amazing sporting ability and they don't make it to the national team or the Olympics, then that's a waste of talent. And that's the conventional wisdom, and you can totally understand where it comes from, because the basis of that wisdom is that if God has given you a gift, you have a responsibility to use that gift. And that's absolutely aligned with Judaism, that principle, that if Hashem has given you a gift, you are responsible to use that gift in the best way possible, or to its maximum. So that part we agree with the conventional wisdom about, which is if you have a gift, you need to use it in the best way possible. Where we don't see eye to eye with conventional wisdom is how to define the best way possible. So the conventional thinking in our world is, if you have a talent, that talent has to benefit you and possibly others. So let's use an interesting distinction over here. What's the difference? Like I often ask young people, can you name one Jewish mega person in Hollywood? Yeah. And everybody can, right? Everybody can. And it's you know, it's typically going to be whoever happens to be the most popular actor or actress at the time. So at the moment, all the kids say Gal Gadot, right? A few years ago, everybody would say what's her name, Natalie Portman, right? That's how it was. Go back further, they probably would have said Gene Wilder, you know. So then I asked them, can you tell me who performed the first heart transplant in the world? So we can. Young people can't. That's the fascinating thing. And we're South Africans, so we have a vested interest. So obviously we know it's Chris Barnard. Go outside of this, and heart transplant undoubtedly is one of the most significant medical advancements of this period in history, certainly of the last century, right? And the vast majority of people have never heard of him. Now there's somebody who used his talent. Chris Barnard used his talent. Whatever you want to say about the person, I'm sure that there are detractors who say that he was a difficult man or whatever it is. The bottom line is, he used his talents, recognized that he had a talent, used his talent for the benefit of society. There was no guarantee that he'd become famous, and even having become famous, so what did he get for it? You know? Whereas if a person goes into the performing arts, or if a person goes into the sporting world, and sometimes even certain areas of academics, etc., very often the objective is, how's it going to benefit me? No, so people get really excited about these mega big names soccer players, like as if they're some kind of heroes. Sorry to say, very often they're incredibly low-life personalities. They just happen to have a skill, you know, and they're just raking in fortunes of money, but very few of them are using that money for the betterment of society, or, you know, reaching out and touching people, whatever the case is. So the conventional wisdom says if you have a talent, it's a gift, and you must use that gift. Correct, we agree with that. But how you use the gift, that's not necessarily a matter of you get the most Oscars you could possibly get, or you make the most money you could possibly get, or you have the most Facebook followers. So what we see about these women is something really interesting. They, if you think about it, they could have become, firstly, incredibly wealthy, I'm sure, and secondly, incredibly famous. They could have done this traveling show, you know, of weaving from the back. I mean, what did they have as entertainment in those days? Let's be honest, you know. They could have been the Netflix of their day, you know. They could have done amazing. That in their minds, their attitude was, if Hashem has gifted me with a talent, the very first question I have to ask myself is, how do I use this talent for Hashem's purpose? That was their guiding question. So as soon as the project for the Mishkan launches, the first thing that enters their mind is, well, then obviously we have to be the ones to weave what's going to become the roof of the Mishkan, because we've got this unique talent. There are many, many other people over there who could weave as well, but they won't be gifting their talent to God. So their thinking was, how do I gift my talent to God? Hashem gifted me with a talent. It only makes sense that I should gift my talent to God as well. And I feel that when it comes to our own talents, obviously it's something to be conscious of. So if I have a particular talent, how am I gifting my talent to God? And I'm not saying that a person can't make money off their talent or do other things, but the first thought, the first port of call should be, how do I contribute to Hashem's world by having this particular talent? So, you know, for example, a person has an amazing business acumen. That's great. Go out there, make money, but how are you contributing to God? It's not just the tzedakah that you give at the end of the month. It's how are you using business acumen to take Hashem's institutions, for example, and make them successful institutions. Not by putting money into their account every month, but by actually using your business acumen to turn that into a successful enterprise. Or the person who has the ability to teach, the person has the ability to speak, the person has the ability to sing, to entertain, comedy, whatever it is. Got to ask ourselves, well, what do we do to further Hashem's, so to speak, business? And I think that when it comes to our kids and their talents, unfortunately, we're never told that we should turn around to our children and say, listen, you've got this amazing gift from Hashem, you have this particular talent, before we start getting into the details of where you're going to go for school, and will you get a scholarship, and will you turn into the next Lionel Messi or whatever it is. Before we talk about any of that, the first conversation we have to have, and the most ongoing conversation we have to have, is, so how are you using Hashem's gift that you were given for Hashem's purpose? Because you can't take a gift and use it only for yourself. It just doesn't make sense. It's like it's so un-Jewish to think that way. So it's hard in certain areas. It's difficult to see how a person's going to use an athletic gift, for example, to serve Hashem. It's not so simple. Whereas if a person has an academic gift or an oratory gift, well, then it's pretty clear. You know, you go out there, teach, inspire, whatever the case is. But the fact that it's not so easy to identify doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. You can be assured that whenever it is that these women worked out that they could weave goat hairs in this unique way, they probably couldn't see a line to connect that with a way to serve Hashem initially. It's only when the Mishkan became a thing that they were then able to make the connection. But they were only able to make the connection because they must have been thinking along those lines. And I think that's really, really valuable for the parent of a child who has a unique talent, is to have this ongoing conversation. We don't know how it's going to play out necessarily, but you have to be conscious of the fact that when you have this type of a talent, you should always be thinking, so how do I use it to serve Hashem? Because when that opportunity arises, it's too late to start thinking. When that opportunity arises, you have to already be thinking along those lines so that you can plug into that opportunity as soon as it becomes available. And that will also change the way that we deal with, you know, do they go to this school, do they that school, or whatever the case is, because we don't become obsessed with, what if I don't allow them to develop their talent and become famous or first line or first team, or, you know, rather we're saying, I just need them to develop their talent to the point that when there's an opportunity to do something for Hashem, they'll be there. They'll be in that headspace. They'll just click right into it. So it's a radically different approach to dealing with talent than what we're used to, and definitely different to what the rest of the world does. So as Jewish parents, we're not saying, okay, I'm going to get my kids onto the stage of South Africa, or I don't think South Africa has talent anymore. I'm saying I don't think they have the show anymore. If I could get my kid onto, you know, America's Got Talent, or I'm going to get my kid into some kind of specialized, super specialized environment, as a Jewish parent, we should be saying, I want to get my child to a point of having that value, because it's an incredible value to have. And you never ever know when it's going to, you know, when it's going to emerge. I think of a great example of this is you had people in the time of the Holocaust who were artists. And they weren't necessarily the big name artists. They didn't necessarily make it to the big stage. But when the opportunity arose to forge travel documents, passports and the like, to get people out of Europe, suddenly their talent was so incredibly valuable, not in a financial way, but in a far greater sense of value, the value of saving lives. And there's no question that that kind of thing will happen in any talented person's life, as long as their eyes are open. And it's our responsibility to teach our children to live with their eyes open, so that, please God, they see that opportunity when it arises. And then you go from just being a street, whatever you call them, busker, doing you know the weaving trick, to becoming an integral part of Hashem's Mishkan, which is a massive upgrade, a massive value to have in life.